Good morning, and I want to thank Peter and Janet and Nosh for inviting me. I'm going to be talking to you about some work that my group has been doing on the manipulation of networks. And we're particularly interested in how you can build coordination and collaboration structures in networks to affect different, better, sometimes worse outcomes for ego based on how you alter the network around individuals. I don't really know how to do this. Okay, there we go. When we talk about networks and the manipulation of them, many of us are really aware that who we know influences what information we have available. We're all very comfortable with this idea that as I change my position in the network, I change what information I get. So we can look at, for example, Indy and Phryne here and realize that they're both influenced by 5 different actors, and so they're both getting information from a variety of sources. But the other thing that's going on is they themselves are influencing others, right? And so Phryne, for example, is influencing one person, and Indy is influencing 3 others. And in fact, if you notice, Indy is influencing Phryne, and Phryne is influencing Indy. Now, if those are the same Indy and Phryne, that means they have this little reciprocal relationship going on, right? And in a reciprocal relationship, you're effectively creating a micro-echo. I tell you something, you tell it to me back, and we can escalate our ideas between us, right? And in fact, it gets even worse if we're embedded in triads. So here, we have Indy and Phryne, and they sure are, in fact, the same individuals. But Indy, 3 of the people who are influencing him are part of what's called an echo chamber. They're actually a set of individuals, all of whom have mutual connections between them. You know, if it wasn't for computer science, we'd be calling this a clique, okay? And in this echo chamber, what's happening is the ideas are echoing around. So you've got reciprocity going on, but it's reciprocity embedded in triads. And when you embed a reciprocal relationship in a triad, it really mutually reinforces it. So I'm going to pick on our hosts for a second and say that because, you know, Nosh and Peter and Janet are all friends, if Nosh borrows some money from Janet, he may not have paid it back. But because he's also friends with Peter, and Peter's also friends with her, Peter's going to think, Nosh, come on, okay? Reciprocal relationships are much, much strongly more enforced and more there you go, are much more paid attention to when they're in triads. And in these super cliques or echo chambers, they're even more strongly. And one of the things that happens in these things is that as an idea goes, it goes, echoes throughout the entire group. But at the same time, it creates a feeling of the generalized other, what everybody knows. It creates also a feeling of increasing emotional attachment, and emotions can escalate. And so the story that lies behind heedful manipulation is one of changing social network structures and changing the networks of connections to ideas at the same time so that you can lead to these escalation of emotions and lead to increasing commitment. So 2 different principles we often look at. The first is that for an ego, if I want ego to have better outcomes, I can actually heedfully take the network and create collaboration structures within it, heedful network coordination, which will affect better outcomes for the ego. I am not saying that I as ego manipulate my own network. I'm saying I'm the ego here, you're in my network, you're manipulating the network around me heedfully to affect better outcomes for me. The second thing is that heedful network manipulation by alters can also create communities of ignorance. Those outcomes don't have to be better. They could be worse because they could put me in a position where I and others like me don't really have access to the information we think we do. And we become, in effect, not a crowd that is wiser, but a crowd that is more ignorant. And it's the same basic principles. So here we are back to Indy and Phryne again. And there's things. And part of what's going on here has to do with what is the information, what are the ideas that are currently salient. So if all these people that Indy is attached to, like Crystal and Cindy and Jillian, all are part of a group that think that gun control is good, Indy, despite being a gun, touting archaeologist, will eventually say, yeah, maybe gun control is good. I kind of see your point, because he's getting it from so many sources. But if that group doesn't all agree and doesn't really care about whether or not women's rights are degrading, it won't change his opinion. So part of it has to do with not just who are you connected to and are they connected, but what ideas are they connected to, and do they all agree on those ideas? So the heedful manipulation of network involves being aware of the network and being aware of the ideas that are salient in that network and manipulating those for the appearance of agreement. Okay. So first I'm going to talk and show you some stuff. Yes?
Could you go back to the previous slide for a moment?
Yes, maybe.
I'm curious to hear your comments.
I have no idea how to do this on this.
Page down?
I don't have a normal page open. Thank you so much. There we go, yes.
Okay, great. So you were talking about reciprocal relationships. I'm wondering to the degree you think the opinions of that blue cluster will themselves intensify simply because they're connected to Indy. So the very fact that there's an alternative point of view that threatens our point of view as a group will only strengthen our point of view as a group in a way that it wouldn't strengthen if it weren't for that alternative threatening position.
That absolutely occurs. That's not part of the story I'm telling today, but that is absolutely occurs, and we see that happening all the time.
So if that's the case, then does that make the relationship between Indy and the cluster much more complicated? Because while Indy may begin to see the point of view of the cluster because he's connected to it, is Indy a he or she? I don't know. Whatever.
It's irrelevant.
It's irrelevant. It's true. Thank you. So that relationship would be more complicated because while Indy may be seeing the point of view of the cluster now and be more persuaded by it because there's more people saying it, the cluster's point of view at the same time may be becoming more intense simply because Indy's there, which would make Indy's approach to their point of view further away rather than closer.
So in the examples I'm going to show you in the data that I'm using, that particular process is weak and completely irrelevant to what's going on, because that's a very minor part of the whole rest of the stuff that's going on because of the relative sizes of the groups. Okay. Right. All right, so let me go into the first examples. The first example comes from healthcare, and in this I'm going to show you results from two of the different studies we've done. The first one deals with the aged. These are individuals who are nearing end of life, some of them going into hospice, et cetera. And the second study has to do with autistic children. These are very in-depth studies with a lot of qualitative as well as quantitative data. And what we're looking at first is how people are manipulating the network to afford better outcomes for, in the first case, the aged, and the second case, the autistic child. This is not them coordinating their own network, it's the people around them. So in the first study, we have these very in-depth medical vignette data, which are very detailed stories that contain who did what, when, and why information. And we have, therefore, the timing of interactions, we have the key issues discussed, we had who it was discussed with, and the 8 patients vary in outcomes. 4 of them have bad outcomes and 4 of them have good outcomes, okay, relative to their situation in life. So first we ran text mining on it to try to get out all the networks over time, and then we cleaned it by hand because text mining is nowhere near up to the challenge here. This is a typical example of what the data looks like. Okay, we have the actors, who are all the little red dots. We have the various kinds of issues that the individual has, like bacteria, heel ulcers, those are the triangles. We have various tests that are done, and we have various locations. And we want to look at these networks, and we're looking at them over time to identify whether or not coordination of the networks and coordination leads to coordination in what is done, and then affects, therefore, what happens in terms of patient outcomes. So we have, like I said, we have these for all these different patients, almost like every few hours for them in some cases. And without going into detail on all the data, the first thing I want to show you is that if the primary care physician for most of these patients tends to have the highest degree centrality, They tend to be the individual, but it varies across the patients, okay? But they tend to be the most important in terms of the network. The patient themselves, of course, people are paying attention to, but another important person is the patient's family, okay, the yellow ones. What we find in general is that in the networks, and that what is important is how much is the density of the network, because that shows better coordination in this particular case. And we're also finding that who is initiating and building the connections to coordinate the network is critical. In general, what we find is that the individuals who have good outcomes, the egos with better outcomes, are those where the principal care physician is more central in the network, where the network itself is more dense, okay, where there's shorter paths, shorter path lengths in general. And the only time where you get shorter path lengths is when you have coordination, that is network ties, between the primary care physician and the patient's family. When that doesn't occur, you don't get this happening. So better coordination here is leading to better outcomes. Talking with doctors, nurses, etc., they're like, yeah, we see this all the time. This is kind of a common sense result for them, but at least we've got a little bit of data that shows it a little bit. Okay, now let's go on and take this idea into the autism study. Armed with this, we go in and we say, look, we want to help out autistic kids. We would like to get these children to the point where they are able, once they graduate from high school, to live, productive lives where they themselves are able to manage their own care, etc. And one of the ways in which you do that early on is you go through all these interventions to kind of teach them how to become a little bit self-management, to think on their own, etc. So in this study, which is the second of 5 studies in this area, we're actually working with a couple of different schools. We go through and we're tracking the collaboration networks around, the coordinative care networks around these children. We're tracking them through time, and then we're providing them with interventions to the caregivers, not to tell them to do something different with the kids, but to tell them how to understand the networks around the kid more. That's all our intervention is telling them what the network's like, with the idea that this will improve children's outcomes. If you know anything about autism, you'll know that it is extremely difficult to measure performance improvements. There is a huge lot of debates in it, and a lot of the views about are things improving are qualitative assessments from the caregivers that are around the child. So we've been working on this thing to allow for systematic tracking of who is giving care and are they coordinating, to calculate, of course, the network metrics on this information, and to provide back to the caregivers visualizations of these networks, because they just love seeing these visuals, okay? And then, of course, we're looking at the micro networks around the kids. So we recruited a bunch of individuals from 2 different schools. This was very hard to do. And then we're talking about little kids. We're talking about kids in elementary school. Then we designed our study, and we actually conducted 3 waves of information gathering: fall term, spring term, and summer. And we talked about caregivers across family, school, and community, because, of course, they're going in and out of school. These are all mostly low-income individuals, and we're looking at the connections among the individuals. We're looking about the connections to the knowledge that they are sharing, the resources. It's often termed in terms of interventions and training is the way they would often refer to it. But again, it's between the 3 communities, community, school, and home. So for each individual, we know what role they play, and we know how often they interact with the child, which interventions they applied when, why they applied those, whether or not they were trained to apply those interventions, blah, 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 blah. And we're then giving them back information on how to monitor this. So memorize this. The quiz will be in 5 minutes. No. These are the different kinds of things you will see in these high-dimensional networks. We've got 3 kinds of actors: school providers, community providers, and, of course, the family members. We've got the interventions, okay, the resources, and the training. So we're using interventions here as kind of our knowledge kind of indicator for the most part. Let me show you a particular child. This is Brian's web. This is the network around Brian, this high-dimensional network, and so on. In Brian's network, okay, we've got his mother. We've got a number of black squares, okay. This is the quiz. Black squares are community providers. Green squares are the school providers. And all of these blue things, okay, are the various interventions. Okay, and what you see is there's a lot of interventions that are actually being used with Brian. These may be things as simple as reminding them to pick up their fork to actual new training things they go through. The mother is actively involved in giving a lot of these interventions to the child outside the classroom in the evening and during the summer. And if you look at this through time, what you see is the community becomes bigger in the summer and less during the school year. School people are bigger in the school year and not during the summer, and the mother is consistently there through time. If you then go and look at the coordination in the social network area, what you see is that the mother is highly interacting with a large number of the people from the school, also with some of the community providers, and that the school providers all have this kind of little echo chamber built around them. Now, in this particular school, Brian is one of the few children who has this echo chamber within that school. It is there because this mother went in and convinced these people they needed to coordinate and talk together to provide better care for her son. Okay. If you look in terms of the resources that are available, many of the resources are coming through the school. A large number of others are coming through the mother who actively went out to the community and got the resources and tried to convince the community to get these resources in general for her child and for the other children in the area. There is a feeling that Brian is doing better and is more able by the end of this year's process to be more self-sufficient than he was at the beginning of it. Let's look at Brandon. This is Brandon's structure. There's no coordination. Okay? The mother has some interventions they're applying. A couple of people in the school are combining it, doing things. There's no community involvement. Brandon and Brian are about at the same level of autistic behavior. So they really need, it's not that Brandon needs less care, it's that they need about the same. There's just no coordination structure. If we look at the collaboration, there's no collaboration. Brandon's mother rarely talks to anybody at school, only to a couple of the business aides to make sure that she is getting the money resources within the school so that her kid can be in the special ed. Okay, she's not talking to special ed teachers, etc. If you look at where the resources are coming in, they're coming largely from the school. Brandon is getting a much less coordinated care, and all evidence suggests that Brandon is not succeeding as well by the end of the year as was Brian. So what these studies show us together is that coordination really needs a champion. In the case of the elderly, in the case of the children, that champion was another family member. Okay, those individuals had to coordinate, work the network, bring people together to get better outcomes for, their loved one. Coordination tends to move these networks toward denser networks. It tends to move them toward networks that, as dense communities, can build within them their own echo chambers, and once they do that, they take on a life of their own and go off and get resources and so on. But without that champion, without building the dense network, nothing happens. The networks aren't naturally moving toward these kinds of communities. Yes?
Super interesting, and the outcomes are awesome, but I'm wondering how you disentangle the type of mom who would put in the effort to go and create these interactions, influencing an outcome, from the networks themselves influencing an outcome. Can you speak to that a little bit?
So we tried to look at that. First off, philosophically, I'm not sure that they are meaningfully disentangled, because I think who you are and the networks you build are kind of two parts of your brain, okay? So, but we tried to doing that by simply looking at a large number of different kinds of mothers, and by looking at a large number of, they weren't always mothers, large number of different kind of caregivers, and seeing to what extent, was it more that they were outgoing? Was it more, kind of standard psychometrics of their personality, those did not seem to be relevant. What seemed to be relevant was, were they just simply involved and talking with the others, and were they, trying to build network communications. Now, it's very difficult here, especially in the autistic, because very poor individuals, a lot of them don't, it's like, well, do I go in and do this stuff at the school, or do I keep holding down my job at McDonald's, right? And so it became very difficult. We're now engaged in another study where we're trying to disentangle that more. Ask me it again here. We may have even better answers. But in that one, we're actually looking across 5 different schools, and we have much better data on personality characteristics and monetary ability to be involved. So, yeah, so I know it's not the best answer in the world, but that's where we're at. Yeah. Okay. So again, very active. Our bet is that as we give back people this information, it will actually help out those individuals who are not naturally inclined to build networks, and will overall increase the number of networks. And early indicators are that simply providing these groups with images of what an active working network looks like, and showing them how their network looks different, is motivating, at least in the short term, to helping them build these networks. Whether that will be motivating after a year is another story, but that's kind of where we're at now. Okay, so now I want to switch gears and talk about the other side of heedful manipulation. There, what we're seeing in this offline person-to-person network world, that it took a lot of effort on the part of the individual, and they had to actively go out and build these networks, okay? And in the case, this also still speaks a little bit to your question, in the case where we did have parents who themselves wanted to give a lot of interventions, but weren't willing to talk to others, the children were not succeeding as well. Okay. So now we want to look at the other side of the coin, and that is, what if we're not really trying to afford better outcomes for people? What if we're just simply trying to manipulate them? So we're actually going to look at this with respect to social media, and we're going to look to respect to this to using data like Twitter data, and look at the manipulation of opinions, beliefs, money, etc. on the web through this kind of building network structures, building echo chambers, and see how it works in that environment. So it's the same basic principles, but applied differently. Now, in Twitter in particular, if you were to look at all of Twitter and all the big network, okay, it kind of looks like the universe, in the sense that there are these areas where there's just a very dense community, okay? And if you were to color it by how many messages are coming out, those dense areas will get very bright, and then they'll go dim. This one will get very bright, and then it'll go dim. But you'll get these kind of like little star clusters forming. These are what we call topic groups. These topic groups are a set of individuals and a set of ideas that are kind of moving together, okay? They're dense, both in terms of discussion around a topic, and they're dense in terms of the network of connection among the individuals. These connections might be that they're mentioning each other, they might be that they're following each other, they might be that they're retweeting each other, and so on. But within these little topic groups areas, some individuals stand out. Some ideas stand out. Some individuals are the individuals with high out degree. They have high social influence. Some people call them super spreaders. They're connected to a lot of others. They're followed by a lot of others. They're retweeted a lot. And some ideas are very, stand out. They're the ones that become that become viral, that get moved along between a lot of areas, and so on. So what we want to look at is these groups, and look at how these groups can be manipulated, how they can be changed, and are they being manipulated and changed, and so on. So, of course, we start with ISIS. So we start off with a handful, 5, known members of ISIS, and we developed a way of collecting data on Twitter to identify the topic group around this and to identify other ISIS members. What you're seeing here is the network we found, okay, just displayed 3 different coloring schemes. This one is Louvain coloring. This one, we colored it by the language character set they're using. Okay, the third one, we colored it by whether or not the groups were suspended. So first off, this is an example of one of these big topic groups. Within this topic group, there's 3 subgroups These three subgroups are separated both by the issues they're talking about, but also what language they're talking in. This group is predominantly talking in Arabic. This group is a mixture of Arabic and English. And the top one up there is purely in English. There's a couple of little tiny ones out to the side. This little tiny one, for example, was actually talking about nuclear. It was near the time of the nuclear referendum in Scotland, and that was the Scottish people talking about the nuclear referendum, and they were just linked in slightly. Now, I would like to tell you can go off and replicate our study. You can't. I'm sorry. You can't, because I can't give you the data, and Twitter has destroyed the data. They have suspended most of these actors. In particular, all those ones up that are blue have all been suspended. They're not there anymore. Okay? Twitter, with the help of Anonymous, identified these people as being ISIS members, they think, and removed them from the data. Well, one thing that gives us validation that we think we found the group, but this is the topic group we're talking about. And within this group, what you would see happening over time is it got increasingly intense and increasingly emotionally charged about certain issues, and then they would drift to another issue and become emotionally charged about that, and then they would drift to another issue. And that was done and manipulated through the use of these kind of echo chamber groups that we talked about. Groups like this tend to be very much driven by topics or external events. So as new external events would occur, people would join. And if there was an external event for a while, people would get bored with it and would leave. Okay? When they were there, they were part of the dense community. When they would leave, if there weren't new events, they would drop out. If you looked at what language they were talking in, they were talking about different topics. These were truly different topic groups. The group that was speaking all in Arabic was focusing on slightly different issues than were the ones in English. Much of the ones in English were focusing on recruiting women to ISIS. Come, it's a better lifestyle, etc. Much of the stuff that was in Arabic was focusing on different ways of building IEDs at this point in time. Okay, but they were kind of connected. Okay, so within this, people are, like I said, some of the individuals are super spreaders, are super influential. And what we looked at is we looked at how these individuals could be pulled out from this. First off, we found individuals who were acting as recruiters. And these individuals who were acting as recruiters were doing things like mentioning others, okay, who they thought were super spreaders, to say, see, these people agree with me, you should come join ISIS. We found that if you looked at those individuals who were mentioning others a lot, they were also linking to these URLs like YouTube and Twitter and propagating their message by spreading it across multiple media at once. Okay, fine, that's nice, but that doesn't help us with our network argument. What did help it is these social influence bots. Within this structure, we found these what we call social influence bots. Now, Twitter is filled with bots, okay? Some people estimate it's up to over 20% of the actors on Twitter are actually bots. And many of these bots are things like Big Ben. It's 2 o'clock and all is well. It's 3 o'clock and all is well, okay? This is something totally different, okay? This is a set of tweeters, okay, that are actually little computer programs, often 20 or more of these, that all have reciprocal ties to each other. They're all mentioning each other. And they will go around and they will, repeat messages to each other, and they will respond to each other and so on. Okay, fairly sophisticated. This bot underlies this structure and is actually increasing the tension and increasing the discussion that's going on in here. Now, this echo chamber, which is all bots, goes out and it finds out who in this group is highly influential. It finds this super spreader. And it finds this one person, this imam. This imam is known as one of those whom Al-Qaeda said was important and relevant for providing the intellectual momentum, the argument for why violence was acceptable in Tunisia and in Yemen. Okay, very thoughtful thinker and so on. It is unlikely that this person, that the imam, knows what is going on. Okay, this bot found this person who was already a super spreader and started re-spreading and retweeting that person's information, making it go out even further than it had before. Now, one of the things that happens in Twitter is if you have a group of individuals who all start retweeting the same individual, Twitter says, oh, that must be an important person. I am going to recommend that person to you, and to you, and to you, and to you. So what Twitter then started doing was recommending that imam even more to all the members of this big, dense community. Some of those individuals then started following that imam even more and built, the entire group became more dense and more connected. Then what happened is that bot also then started tweeting about and using a URL to this particular app. That app is, if you go and you go into it and sign up for it, it then goes and it solicits money from you for a charity for the children of Syria. That particular charity is a well-known money laundering site for ISIS. So first it's building the density of the community by pulling in information from this one who's highly connected. Then it's sending information about the other, which gets all of these individuals to say, hey, I'm listening to this. This is also being recommended. Maybe I should go there too. And they go there and they say, oh, okay, let's start giving money. Now, Twitter does another diabolical thing to you, and you may not realize it. When it's sending out information to you, it puts it in a scroll window. Oh, it's great. I can ignore everything, right? I just have to scroll through. Tweets are coming out so fast that you may not realize what is down there at the bottom. You only see what's most important. Twitter prioritizes what information you see based on the number of others that are also tweeting about it. So it would prioritize to people this information about that app. Now, you say, okay, this is ISIS, I don't care. Same strategy is being used by drug companies, same strategy is being used in marketing of diet drugs. These kind of social influence bots are all over the place. Okay, and they spread the analysis, they spread the narrative, yes?
Just very quickly, so this whole set of chain reactions that you've identified
Yes.
is really quite interesting. And it's all an illusion created by bots that people think are people. How come there's not a counter effort to create a bot that essentially says the opposite?
Okay, actually there are.
Uh-huh.
There are these little information warfare bot wars going on right now. There's a lot of ethical and political reasons why certain groups will not create and use these things, and there's other groups that don't care about, but there are efforts to do that as well.
So is the counter bot strategy effective?
We don't know. In fact, that's one of our new projects is to study whether or not that's effective. Okay. We just got conclusive evidence of these kind of bots about a year ago, and PLOS ONE has been sitting on our paper for a year and a half. They've been sitting on this paper.
Been there, that sucks.
Yeah.
Quick question. How do you identify the bots in a way that Twitter doesn't? Because Twitter is trying to filter them out too.
No, Twitter's not really trying to filter out bots.
They say they do.
Yes, Twitter is a business model, and they're only trying to rule out those bots that they think are reducing the Twitter experience and therefore are doing something that people are complaining about, like spreading malicious information or, cussing a lot or whatever. They have it's in Twitter's best interest to not suspend actors that they're not sure are bots, because they might be individuals. Okay? So they're not actively looking for these kind of things. Most people are not finding these bots because most people are looking at Twitter using one of either the random feeds or using one of the X% feeds, and you can't find these looking at it in these ways. We had to actually come up with a special network technique for finding these things. So Twitter has no interest in removing these. Yes?
Are these bots kind of available, say, off the shelf on
Yes.
some shady sites? So this
Not even that
doesn't
shady. You can just go out and buy them.
computer science expertise.
Yeah, you can go out and buy these, and that's why we're seeing the number of these bots, we believe, has skyrocketed in the last year and a half. So you can now buy these technologies easily and use them, which is why we're seeing them all over the place. Yeah. And mainly what they're doing is spreading narratives. Sometimes all they're doing is advertising. So we found, a dozen or so of them right now that are operating in Russia right now that are simply advertising, oh, there's this great lawyer in Moscow. Go use him as your favorite lawyer. So, they're also used for advertising. Okay. So these are examples of the kinds of the manipulation of structure. But there's another thing that these bots can do and that are doing. And that is they can build communities and then go dormant. So we actually came across this one by accident. We were actually looking at helping NATO and analyzing NATO dialogue, okay? And in the middle of that dialogue, all of a sudden this bot shows up. And it turns out there were two communities that were kind of on the fringes of NATO. One was an alt-right community, and another was an evangelical women's group. Each of these groups have a political agenda of their own. Each of these groups are these kind of dense structures, okay? And, you know, and last July they were both heating up a little bit, so they had more conversations, more discussions. All of a sudden this social influence bot appears on the screen, and what it does is it finds a super spreader in the alt-right. It found a super spreader in the evangelical group. It started retweeting both of those, which caused Twitter to recommend to both of those groups, members of the other group. And all of a sudden, the evangelical group, if you watch them, what they were seeing in their tweets were these tweets from the alt-right and saying, well, that's not normally what we agree to, but I guess everyone else agrees. And so it was building consensus, what appeared to be consensus, because it looked like all the other members of their group were agreeing to this, because they didn't have a way of discriminating which group the data came from. So it was building this link between these groups. Once the groups were linked and enough individuals from the one group were following the other and vice versa, the bot went dormant. So these bots come and go pretty rapidly, and they build connections among groups and build new dense connected groups. By doing that, they can manipulate the conversation and change what people are thinking are important, and create the appearance of full grassroots support for particular actors. Once they create the appearance of it, the appearance becomes real. Okay, so we get these social bots. They follow general opinion leaders. They increase spreads of messages. They then go and mention each other. They create the appearance of widespread group. They increase the spectrum of agreement. And then the scroll-through technology that Twitter uses enhances and makes it even stronger, makes the effect even stronger. Because most of us are lazy. We're not going to scroll down to the bottom. Other thing that these bots are doing is that they will actually have these apps you sign up for, and many of the apps, if you sign up to them, have this little clause that people usually don't see because it's in the fine print that says, may I tweet from your account now and then? Most people just, yeah, sure, whatever. So that then causes a second thing to happen, which is that those bots then tweet from your account about whatever message they want, making all your friends who follow you think you're saying certain things and giving the appearance of agreement. And they do it so infrequently, and because of the scroll technology, these messages from you that you may never agree to, you may not even see them unless you scroll through every single message that came out of your account and found out that they were there. Yes?
Don't people on Twitter say, hey, to their friend, I just got this message from you that says this, and I've never heard you say that before, or this is really outrageous. I think this is terrible for what you're saying. Did you hear that?
We are starting to get reports of people doing that, yes. And that's one of the reasons a lot of people are moving away from Twitter, because it's just overwhelmed with this.
So it's affecting then, potentially, in the long run,
Yes.
the group in the opposite direction.
Yes. And yet we're not seeing that happening yet, but we're starting to see the beginning noise about that. Okay. So these bots, like I said, they're all over the place. These are all bot-driven communities that are associated with the alt-right, which we found by accident. And each one of them has a social bot behind it. And the social bots, as far as we can tell, are responsible for increasing the size and growth of these communities and making these communities all think that they agree with each other, even though they did not originally. Okay? The bots have also been used to actually alter who is in the community. Another example of the way to do it is because you're affecting not just the structure of the community, you're affecting what it is, the messaging, and you can create cognitive dissonance in groups, and this is now getting a little bit more to your point, which by doing the following. In one of these groups, which is now labeled the pornography group, did not start out that way. In fact, it started out, that one is actually part alt-right and part Ukrainian elves. And on the Ukrainian elf side, They're the elves because they're anti the Russian trolls. Okay, people have fun with names. But what they did was, it was originally a mixed gender group, and they were really wanting to recruit more of the young men in the group to become soldiers and fight against the Russians, or to agree with the Russians. And so what they did is these bots started going into this group and started sending out the tweets, but they would add on images of scantily clad women, which caused the women to have great cognitive dissonance with, and said, well, if you guys are going to act this, I'm just going to go away and not be part of this group. But it caused some of the young men to say, yay, verily, and more of them joined. And they switched the gender makeup of this group at the same time. Okay, many of these, yes?
Just about methodology. Could you talk a little bit about how you're identifying that it's these bots?
Yes, but let me come back to that in 1 minute. I will definitely go to that. Okay. Just two more things I want to mention about these. One of the things that these groups are also doing is when they're communicating out by linking and putting in URLs for things like videos, images, URLs to websites, news sites, and so on. And one of the ways they strengthen the community argument is by pointing to news sites. As far as we can tell, 50% of the news sites they're pointing to now are fake news sites. And by putting in the fake news site judiciously in these, okay, and because people are only getting the headlines, they're not realizing they're coming from fake news sites. They think they're coming from real news sites. And they're reducing people's ability to distinguish fake news from real news within these, making it appear the BBC breaking news, for example, is as fake as that coming out of RT Russia, which is a known fake website. Okay, last one I want to do is that they're also building on this using humor. This is actually from Anaconda. These groups will also spread messages that have images attached that are funny. This is actually a really funny one. That's actually a Russian bear in a cab, and in Russia it says, "Which way is Finland?" Okay, thereby sending this very interesting message, which we can talk about offline. But these groups are enhancing their presence using images and using humor. And believe me, our technology is not great at discovering it. And finally, they're enhancing it by using fake images. This is actually a case where they increased the information in a group and made the overall group, become more intense and escalated their emotions by sending out these images. This image in particular escalated the number of people in that ISIS group. It probably doubled it practically. It was purported to be showing American soldiers molesting young women, Arabic women. In point of fact, that image is actually Polish pornography, okay? But most human beings do not have the 2 weeks of resources to figure this out and to go to the State Department to get it confirmed that this is the case in order to figure it out. So instead, everybody just believed the image for what it was. So going back to your question, how do we know that these groups are there? In part because of their actions, but in part because of the way we track them. Their consequences now are leading to escalating of emotions in ways that go well beyond the cyber world. This is an example showing these bots were there, they were escalating emotion, they were escalating anti-US sentiment, anti-Russian sentiment. Pick your country, they're going to do it. And what you would see happening is within a few days after that, the number of cyber attacks on the country where the emotion against it had escalated increased, much more than could be expected by chance, so leading to an increase in attacks. So basically, we're looking for heedful and manipulation. The way we find these bots in cyberspace is by using a combination of snowball sampling and clustering with complete information on where the news agencies are, the political groups, and the verified celebrity actors. And we have this big iterative process my group has developed that is out under review right now for that process. And it's, but at the heart of it is its snowball and dense community subgraph detection on bispectral data. How's that for an answer on that? Okay. So and I can show you the paper on it. Okay. So yes.
Very quick question. In a simple way, would a bot have more out degree than in degree in a way that's noticeable? I mean, like a very simple way that to me seems like a rule.
There are a class of bots that do look like that, but not all. First off, there's many, many kinds of bots. And some bots have that feature. Most bots still appear as anomalies, but one of the characteristics of these is not the more out degree than in degree, but it's the fact that they build this echo chamber. They have this complete echo chamber. They still have a lot of out degree, they still have a lot of in degree beyond that, but they have this complete echo chamber. This complete dense, they have this, they're a perfect clique, whereas most of the human groups are not perfect cliques yet. And that's really what characterizes this particular kind of bot.
Because in many cases, they have what's called bot farms.
Yeah.
So you have one bot that you're really wanting to make do the stuff, but you create a whole bunch of other bots
Yeah.
that have in degrees to this bot to offset the appearance that you
But
have.
those
Yeah,
ones,
But the other-
but those
the
ones
other
don't
bots-
operate like these.
Exactly.
These don't
The other
operate
bots
like
would
these.
have, the other bots would have a high out degree, but not a high in degree.
But
Yeah.
those bots are
Those are
Confederate
the
bots.
Those are
actually
Confederates,
the action
yeah.
bots. They just brought it as
Yeah.
Confederates
Yeah.
to make this bot look good.
Yeah.
Yeah, but if you get rid of the Confederates, then the bot you want to look good can't look good anymore.
True.
True.
I guess that's what I'm thinking.
True, but
So-
that's not these kind. That won't work.
I have a question,
Yes.
Kathleen. Just say hypothetically, if the Director for National Intelligence were to come to you and say, you're talking about two different types of strategies that might be able to help deal with what you're showing us. One is build good bots, so better bots. This is, I think, the prime and the counter bots, right? And then try to essentially play their game and do a cat and mouse with them. The other alternative that you alluded to is that there are algorithmic decisions that Twitter is making that is enabling these processes.
Right.
So is it better to work with Twitter to help them make the algorithms less, to modify their algorithms? Or are we better off with a counterbot strategy? Or is there one that is clearly better than the other?
So within the U.S., given our authorities for action, it's better to get to work with Twitter and get them to alter their strategies, because we don't have the authorities to put out our own bots like this.
But does that then affect the ability of all the good coalition building, let's say the Women's March, that also benefits from some of the same algorithmic?
It would also
of
affect their
Twitter?
ability to do that. They would have to do it more through true grassroots development and building subgroups. Yeah. Yep. Yeah. 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 Yeah, it's very difficult. The other thing is that a lot of this, you have to realize, is actually starting to move out to other social media. And a lot of these strategies are actually being originally developed in the massive multiplayer online game community and then transferred over into Facebooks and Twitters and BK and all of those systems. Yes?
So I think in the end, you need a method that can ensure that the cost of creating something fake equals the cost of creating something good. And let this be a war based upon the amount of dollars. You can, the best that method, you cannot have a scheme in which the cost of trying to create something good is less than the cost of trying to create something fake. And we are in this case because this strategy that Twitter has employed, the cost of creating something fake is much less than the cost to fight. So I think you fight it on the grounds of strategy or method, but finally it has to be fought based upon the amount of money. And the cost to deploy has to become high enough that it will stop being worth it for it.
But remember, this is multicultural and across many, many countries, and the cost is not even across those countries in terms of doing things like this. So it'll cost something different to build these in China than it will in Indonesia, than it will in Russia, than it will in the US. So it's a little more complicated because it is a multi-country system. I'm sorry. Yes?
Do you have time for another question?
Yeah?
Do we have time?
He just pointed to something.
So I'm just, this is very provocative, and we're thinking about technological solutions. I wonder if there's a human solution to this. So, like you boil down social science, there's three ways that people think there's truth, right? So there's like, I know the facts. It feels emotionally true, even though it may not be, and therefore I believe it.
Mhm.
And then there's like the social proof. And the thing that makes that work is when people don't have a framework for analyzing what's going on. Do you think it's possible to educate people about this so that individuals themselves would be more likely to sniff out fake news by giving them information on how this works?
We've had a little bit of success in doing that, and all the stuff we've been doing, training folks at NATO and at Stratcom and so on in that. So I think it'll help. I don't think it'll be perfect because these things are evolving, and there's always a new variant around the corner, and people learn for the specific, and they're very bad at generalizing to the general process. But I think it's part of the solution.
So historically, what do we know about how you stop propaganda? Because propaganda works in very similar ways.
Right. Yeah, well, I mean, part of the way you stop propaganda is you create alternative. You distract or deploy alternative information. But if you try to hit propaganda head on, you almost always create a group that becomes more entrenched in that thing. There's a book called Fighting Crazies. That's kind of what's going on here. Yeah. Other question? No more questions? Is of time. Yes.
I have a question. It's interesting to think about these bots, and I'm wondering, in your identification of them,
Uh-huh.
if you know about the mechanisms that make them so important and so powerful. And I'm wondering, how much of it is kind of intentional from the part of the person who is creating them versus, they're just trying to get those images out and they don't really understand and see the social consequences of that. And so, you were mentioning before about how they are morphing and changing. And I'm wondering if you could say a little bit about kind of what they are and what they do and how they're created. I mean, have you learned about that through identifying?
So we actually could not have done this if we had not done the autism study, because that actually gave us the basic theoretical ideas that allowed us to go in and do this. Because you see the same principles in human manipulation of network without technology. It's just enhanced here. It's like it's on steroids. In terms of how these things are evolving and changing, which is I think part of what you're getting at, some of the original bots were what we call the dumb bots. They were things that simply were either retweeting from lots and lots of different locations, more than a human being could really travel from, or they were retweeting too fast, too many messages, or they were retweeting the same words, or their sentence structure was just complete nonsense words, or they had way more mentions than the typical person was tweeting. So they were anomalies. Very easy to detect, very easy to find. Even Twitter finds those. Even Twitter's, if they think they're harmful, they will stop them. Otherwise, they won't. They'll leave them there if they think they're not harmful. Okay, like Big Ben. Then after that, there were ones that started to try to imitate humans, but try to hijack or what's called threadjacking conversations. And what they would do is they would latch on to whatever the trending topics were and who the trending topics. And they would take those, which they found by the hashtags, they would retweet those hashtags, but they would always add their own hashtag to it. And they would build a consensus structure in the knowledge space and the knowledge network that this idea was now associated with this other idea. And then get people to move more toward those. The third step, as far as we can tell, was this movement to more the social influence ones, which are building these kind of entire groups that are mutually retreating each other and trying to manipulate the social structure at the same time. What's next? Well, I don't know. We're watching out for that. I don't know. But does that begin to get at some of what's going on? In all.
It seems like some of it is like unintended consequences.
Well, for some actors it is. We don't believe that every single person knows exactly what they're doing when they buy one of these farms. For other groups, we do believe they know what they're doing, but the evidence that they know what they're doing is not available in a single media. You have to go across medias. And the only reason we have some belief that at least some of the groups know what they're doing is because we've been able to inadvertently tap into some of the conversations as they move from one environment to another. Like from Twitter into Facebook or from Twitter into the dark web or whatever. And have been able to hear them talking about how they use these, but not always. We also know that there are groups that train people on how to threadjack and how to alter conversations in various social media and so on, and a lot of that occurs at various conferences, but also at various on the dark web and through images and through videos. Yeah.
As people become more aware of these things, and they will,
Yeah.
people are dumb, is this just going to lead to the collapse of these spaces?
Yeah,
as
well,
meaningful places to.
I think you're already seeing that. I mean, I think the high days of using Twitter are almost over because of that. Because more and more people are leaving Twitter because they're tired of the fact that something like 50% of messages appear to be coming from bots, and 24% of the actors are bots. You're starting to see people move to other media, but my view is that bots are going to move with them, and that as a medium becomes overwhelmed with junk, then people will move to a new medium. I think we're just going to be playing this kind of game for a while. But we're seeing that kind of thing happening already. And that's one of the reasons people like Instagram and some of the other ones that they're moving toward, is because they think they don't have bots. Yes? You?
Fascinating stuff, really interesting. But one question I have is I think to a certain extent you see the things you hear a group of people believing something, but the election just happened, and to me it's education doesn't make a difference, because I was talking, I have a friend a former Trump supporter. I said there's so many evidence, there's a lot of what he said is not true, but educating them, telling that to people, it doesn't make a difference. So to me, it's I feel like the online thing you hear it over and over again, but to what extent it really changing people? So that is something. This is really fascinating. I think you see the, a lot of community, perceived consensus out there. But on the other hand, I don't know, really changing people because.
So this is really changing the way people view about the world. These bot things are really changing it. I mean, we saw active evidence of them manipulating communities and altering votes for many different countries. Okay, because what it's doing is it's relying on some basic social cognitive principles, right? It creates in people's mind. Okay, we all have this notion of the generalized other, right? What everyone knows, kind of thing. This manipulates what people view is in the generalized other and what the generalized is saying. It creates the appearance of grassroots support. It leads to people. It then it actually explodes confirmation bias. Okay, and it also builds in, at least locally, increased confirmation of commitment. That is, individuals will be part of these groups. They will get information that seems counter to it, and then they have a choice. They can leave the group or they can stay. And if they stay, they have to buy into the crazy. And what you're seeing happening is some people will leave, but other people will buy in, at least temporarily, to the crazy. So it's using a basic cognitive social psych principles, but by manipulating these networks. Thank you.